Not every civilization that walked this earth is remembered. Some disappeared so flawlessly, so completely, that even speaking their names feels like trespassing into forbidden history. Yet every now and then, a torn corner of an ancient map hidden in the dusty archives of the Florence Cartography Institute, a 17th-century manuscript whispering about roads beneath the Indian Ocean, or a strange geological layer off the coast of India, they all murmur the same name. Lemuria. In What If Lemuria Was Real? The Lost Empire Before Atlantis, we explore a forgotten world once proposed as scientific truth. A vanished continent said to bridge Madagascar with South Asia. 19th-century scholars considered it the key to mysteries they couldn't explain. Identical primate species separated by thousands of miles of ocean, cultural echoes across distant shores, and legends older than recorded time itself. But as science evolved, Lemuria didn't vanish because its clues disappeared. It vanished because its implications were far too inconvenient, too vast, too ancient, too strange. So what if Lemuria was real? What if an empire older than Atlantis once ruled the oceans and left behind traces we were never meant to find? Could there have been a civilization before Sumer, before Egypt, before memory itself? One that left echoes not in monuments, but in myths, symbols, and buried clues stretching across continents. And if so, why were we so quick to forget? You're listening to Deformed History. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. They found it in the wrong place. Not far from the southern coast of Tamil Nadu, just beyond the fishing villages of Pumbihar, where the Bay of Bengal stretches wide and windless, divers in the late 20th century uncovered something that should not have been there. A line of submerged stones, carved, aligned, too deliberate to be the work of nature. At first it was dismissed as an anomaly, a natural rock formation, perhaps, or coral. But further dives revealed what geologist S.R. Rao would later describe in quiet tones. The outlines of walls, platforms, and steps leading down, not up. This was not Atlantis. It was older. It had no grand myths woven around it, no philosopher like Plato to immortalize it in metaphysical allegory. What they were touching, through diving gloves and cold currents, may have been the forgotten edge of a world long drowned. And more than that, it lay at the very fringe of memory, unclaimed, unnamed, uneasy. If the sea could speak, perhaps it would whisper of Kumari Kandam, the mythical sunken landmass spoken of in Tamil literature for over 2 millennia. Long dismissed by modern scholars as poetic metaphor, Kumari Kandam appears again and again in ancient Sangam texts. In these verses, the land was once vast, lush, and home to flourishing kingdoms that held sway over a forgotten Indian Ocean world. Kings ruled for generations before the sea claimed it back. And for the Tamil poets, this wasn't fantasy. It was a recollection. The 20th century Tamil revivalist movements took this myth and raised it high, shaping it into cultural identity. But well before politics or nationalism co-opted the idea, early Western naturalists had noticed something strange too. In 1864, zoologist Philip Sclater struggled with a conundrum. Why did lemurs exist both in Madagascar and India, but nowhere in between? He hypothesized the existence of a lost landmass, Lemuria, that once connected these regions before being swallowed by the ocean. It was not conjecture born from mysticism, but from biology. Lemuria. The name sounds mythic now, tainted by decades of pseudoscientific misuse. But back then, it was offered in earnest, a plausible solution in a world that had yet to fully embrace plate tectonics. Before the slow dance of continents was understood, a sunken bridge made sense. The idea appeared in geological journals, natural history books, even museum lectures. And for a while, Lemuria was treated with respect. But something changed. The rise of continental drift theory rendered land bridge theories obsolete. Lemuria was exiled from science, not disproven, merely discarded. It became a myth, not because it was false, but because it was no longer necessary. And as history often goes, what science forgets, mysticism reclaims. Theosophists in the late 19th century breathed new life into Lemuria, though in forms unrecognizable to Sclater or Rao. Madame Blavatsky spoke of Lemurians as a root race, towering psychic beings who predated Atlantis. Others followed with their own interpretations, a cradle of human consciousness, a spiritual Eden before the fall. And just like that, Lemuria drifted from geology to occultism, from academic journals to seance circles. But strip away the veils of mystic hyperbole, and a question remains. Was there, once, a vast landmass connecting South India and Madagascar? And if so, did it hold more than rocks and fossils? Recent underwater surveys near Pamfuhar continue to puzzle. Sonar mapping suggests the presence of geometric structures at depths inconsistent with the current coastline. Some formations appear aligned to celestial coordinates, solar markers, perhaps, or ritual enclosures. Marine archaeologists remain cautious, wary of jumping to conclusions. But a few admit, off-record, that these aren't simple reefs, they're old, much older than previously thought. Could these be remnants of pre-Holocene coastal cultures, washed away during the post-glacial sea rise? Between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the Ice Age thawed, global sea levels surged over 120 meters. Entire stretches of land vanished. What we now call continental shelves may have once been fertile plains, river valleys, even cities. In India, the Gulf of Khambhat yielded another surprise in 2001. Sonar images of grid, like patterns underwater. A discovery so controversial that it sparked both excitement and condemnation. Were they man-made? Natural? The debate raged and then, predictably, was shelved. But what if Pamfuhar and Khambhat are not isolated anomalies, but clues to a larger submerged reality? In myth, Lemuria or Kumari Kandam was not just a landmass. It was a civilization, a cradle of learning and philosophy. Tamil legends speak of 3 sangams, ancient literary academies, held across epochs. The first 2, according to tradition, were held in cities now lost to the sea. The third, in Madurai, is the only one that survives in historical memory. Could it be that the Sangam poets were echoing not imagination, but inheritance? Here lies the fracture. The academic world demands evidence, carbon dating, stratigraphy, reproducibility. The mythic world deals in resonance, cultural continuity, the stubborn persistence of stories passed down in oral loops for thousands of years. Somewhere between them is the truth, wrapped in salt and sediment. And so we return to the diver's question, not the one they speak aloud, but the one that hangs in their silence when they rise from the water, pull off their masks, and stare at the coastlines of today with unfamiliar eyes. If these stones are real, if these walls once held breath and fire, who built them? And what did the sea take that it still hasn't given back? Long before the first diver descended into the gray-blue veil off the coast of Pampahar, another witness stood at the edge of the known world. His name was Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta Maurya in the 3rd century BCE. In his lost but oft-quoted Chronicle Indica, fragments of which survive through later historians like Arrian and Strabo, he described a land at the southern limits of the Indian subcontinent, one inhabited by people taller than all others who worshipped the ocean and claimed descent from fire. No other source corroborates this. No ancient Indian text speaks of fire-blooded coastal giants. Yet the reference lingers like a glitch in the grand narrative. What exactly did Megasthenes see or hear that caused him to record such a detail? Was it misinterpretation, embellishment, or was it a distorted memory passed down by locals, an echo of something older, barely remembered? Historians often dismiss such anomalies as errors in translation or fantasy. But when viewed against a growing archive of oral traditions and submerged ruins, even the strangest details begin to shift from fiction to pattern. Patterns. That is what the 21st century science of geomythology seeks. To uncover factual geological events hidden within ancient myths. It's a field that stands awkwardly between disciplines, part seismology, part anthropology, part literature. It proposes that floods, earthquakes, and even tectonic shifts may have left such a powerful mark on early human societies that they were preserved through story rather than stone. And nowhere is this more pronounced than in South Asia's flood myths. From the Bhagavata Purana to the Manimekalai, and even across the ocean in Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime legends, there exist persistent narratives of a land lost to rising waters, always toward the east or south, always described as rich and sacred. In the Tamil epic Silappatikaram, composed around the 2nd century CE, a solitary verse laments the destruction of cities along a coast swallowed by the sea. The poem offers no further comment, as if the fact of the catastrophe needed no elaboration. Everyone already knew. But how could a poet in the 2nd century speak with such casual certainty about lands lost thousands of years earlier? Unless the memory had somehow endured? This is not unheard of. In 2017, cognitive archaeologists working with indigenous communities in Australia documented over 21 distinct oral traditions describing shorelines and islands that had long since disappeared beneath the sea, some dating back over 7,000 years. Geological surveys confirmed that these stories aligned, often with uncanny accuracy, to paleocoastal maps. Human memory, it seems, can be far more durable than we've ever credited. So let us reframe the question. What if Lemuria was not a myth born from confusion, but a mnemonic container, a vessel to hold the memory of a time when the Indian Ocean looked utterly different? A time when the coast of South India didn't stop at the beach, but stretched outward for miles, maybe hundreds of miles, dotted with cities, temples, observatories. And then it ended, not in war, not in fire, but in silence. When sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum, an event so gradual and yet so irreversible, it must have seemed to those who lived through it like the world itself was sinking. The planet changed not in a century, but in a lifetime. Rivers vanished, hills became islands, coastlines curled inward like burning parchment, and those who survived carried the weight of that loss, not in documents, but in language. We often think of history as something written, something carved in rock or painted on walls. But when water becomes the archive, only the imagination survives. Myth, in this sense, is not fantasy. It is a kind of sedimented truth. The case of the Mahabalipuram 7 pagodas reinforces this strange convergence. According to legend, 6 magnificent temples once stood beside the still surviving shore temple, forming a sacred complex. British explorers in the 18th century scoffed at the idea. There was no evidence. But after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami receded, local fishermen pointed to what the sea had briefly revealed. Stone walls, sculptures, and steps all offshore, exposed just for a few hours before being swallowed again. Archaeologists scrambled to the site. What they found was deeply unsettling, signs of ancient construction where none should have been. If temples and cities could be lost like that in a single generation, what else lies beneath the silt? Lemuria, as a concept, does not offer a single coherent theory. It is a convergence zone, where biology, mythology, geology, and memory collide. Even the name itself, coined by Sclater and later embraced by colonial scholars, carries the scent of European taxonomy. The original idea, born of lemur fossils, became something else entirely as it was pulled into the tides of culture. But before it became a spiritual utopia or an esoteric cipher, Lemuria was a question that refused to go away. Why do identical megalithic patterns, stone alignments, solar markers, truncated pyramids, appear across such vast geographies with no clear link between them? Why does the Tamil language, among the oldest living tongues on Earth, contain echoes of linguistic structures found in Madagascar's Malagasy dialects and even in Austronesian roots? And why do so many flood myths across so many islands and peninsulas in the Indian Ocean basin point toward the same vanishing line on the horizon? This is not an invitation to believe. It is an invitation to listen, carefully, closely, to the ground beneath us and the stories floating just above it. Because maybe Lemuria isn't a place at all. Maybe it's a question we keep returning to, like the sound of waves on stone, rhythmic, unresolved, and ancient beyond knowing. It began with a bone. In 1863, German biologist Ernst Haeckel, sifting through evolutionary puzzles in his study, proposed a now-forgotten idea. That somewhere in the Indian Ocean had once existed a vast landmass where early humans, perhaps even the first humans, originated. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. Haeckel, known today for his elaborate zoological illustrations, was wrestling with Darwin's theories and the lack of fossil evidence bridging human ancestry across the Eastern Hemisphere. How, he asked, could humanity's evolutionary line stretch from Africa through Asia without some missing stage in between? He postulated Lemuria not as myth but as biological necessity. Of course, science would later move on, shifting its gaze toward Africa as the cradle of mankind. But Haeckel's proposition, though later abandoned, wasn't plucked from fantasy. It emerged from a deep frustration with unexplained patterns in morphology, genetics, and fossil distribution. And perhaps more significantly, it emerged in parallel with other voices, across cultures, pointing to a submerged memory in the same ocean. In the late 19th century, just as European science was discarding Lemuria, Hindu revivalists in colonial India were reviving another name for the same idea, Kumari Kandam. The timing wasn't coincidence. British Orientalists had translated the Sangam epics and scattered Tamil texts, often condescendingly. But native scholars recognized something deeper. In the Irayanar Ekapurul, a Tamil commentary dated around the 10th century, but quoting far older sources, there is mention of a landmass lost to the ocean, where poets once convened in cities now claimed by the deep. These weren't metaphors, they were treated as historical events. The oceans, the text claimed, had swallowed 49 territories and 12 great cities. And this is where the spiral deepens, because the number 12 appears again in unexpected places. The ancient Greeks described the Dodecapolis, 12 sacred cities believed to form the political and religious heart of early Ionian civilization. The Chinese recorded 12 earthly branches, used in their cosmological calendar, each tied to a directional and elemental system. In Mesoamerican cosmology, 12 often recurs in the context of lost epics. Is this coincidence, numerology, or were these cultures, separated by oceans and epics, pulling faintly on the same thread? To dismiss such parallels outright is easy. Correlation does not imply causation, but neither should pattern be ignored, especially when it persists across mythic architectures so vastly separated. Myths are not science, but they are not noise either. They are echoes, encoded memories reduced over time into story. And what do these stories say? In nearly every flood myth across South and Southeast Asia, there is a strange emphasis not merely on loss, but on instruction. The land that vanished was not just fertile. It was wise. It held knowledge. In the Monomeklai, the heroine wanders through the remains of a drowned city and encounters ascetics who speak of a forgotten time when men measured the heavens with stone. Not gods, men. This idea that ancient humans possessed astronomical sophistication far beyond what we credit them isn't limited to South Asian texts. In Indonesia's Java Island, the Gunung Padang site has sparked fierce debate in recent years. At first glance, it appears to be just another megalithic hilltop. But seismic surveys revealed layers of buried structures, with some carbon-dated materials suggesting human modification as far back as 20,000 years ago. If confirmed, it would overturn every timeline we've drawn about organized human society. And yet, few outside of specialized circles know of Gunung Padang. Like the ruins at Yonaguni, off Japan's Ryukyu Islands, underwater terraces and steps that defy natural explanation, it remains locked in limbo, too structured to be dismissed outright, too controversial to be fully embraced. Just like Pumfuhar, just like Kampot, just like the whisper of Lemuria. Perhaps the greatest irony is that, while scholars debate these findings in the present, the past keeps speaking in symbols. Consider the Tamil zodiac. Unlike Western astrology, which divides the sky into 12 houses based on solar movement, the Tamil system, especially as preserved in ancient Siddhantic texts, relates each house to both a direction and a geographic region. One such house, corresponding to the south-southeast, is linked to the land of submerged temples. In some manuscripts, this is marked not with a name but with a gap, an intentional blank, as though the scribe were acknowledging something both known and forbidden. But what knowledge could be so dangerous it must be erased? One answer lies not in history, but in language. The Tamil language, classified as Dravidian, is not Indo-European. Its roots are deep, possibly predating Sanskrit by millennia. Its grammatical structures, phonetic cadences, and poetic conventions are self-contained, almost like a linguistic island. When linguists tried to find its relatives, they turned to the mountains of Central Asia, the valleys of Mesopotamia, and, most curiously, the islands of Madagascar. Malagasy, the dominant language of Madagascar, is officially Austronesian, but it contains a set of Proto-Dravidian root words, especially in reference to agriculture, stars, and navigation. How could this be? No migration model explains this cleanly. The idea that South Indian sailors made it to Madagascar before 1000 BCE is plausible, but insufficient. It explains trade, perhaps, but not embedded cosmology. Unless, of course, both Malagasy and Tamil once shared a land between them. A land that no longer exists, a land erased not by war nor by time, but by water. And here we pause, not in certainty, but in awe. Because if even part of this is true, if even one submerged city was once real, if even one linguistic overlap is not coincidence, then the map we hold of human history is not just incomplete. It is upside down. You'd expect silence from a sunken world. But sometimes, it speaks in fire. In 2013, on the island of Mauritius, 1,200 miles off the African coast, geologists investigating the island's volcanic origins stumbled across something strange. Mixed within the relatively young basalt rocks were fragments of ancient zircon crystals, minerals formed not in island volcanism, but in continental crust. And not just any crust. This zircon dated back 3 billion years, older than the island by a margin so vast it tore through geological expectations. The findings, published by Björn Jampveit and his team, concluded the impossible. Beneath the modern volcanic surface of Mauritius lay fragments of a lost microcontinent, now named Mauritia. No one had been looking for it. No one expected it. But it was there under the waves, under the lava. A remnant, a shard. Proof that continents do not vanish like dreams. They break, scatter, drown, and sleep. Mauritia is not Lemuria, at least not directly. But it confirmed a premise once mocked. That lost landmasses can and do exist. Their memory preserved not in maps, but in the deep time record of minerals. The Indian Ocean, once thought a stable basin, now revealed a jigsaw of vanished terrains. Fragments of continental crust have since been detected near the Seychelles, Madagascar, even beneath the Mascarene Plateau. It's as if the floor of the ocean holds a mirror, each piece reflecting a geography we no longer teach. Yet here's the twist. The oldest Tamil cosmological texts speak of 7 continents beneath the sea. Not 7 known today, but 7 that were swallowed. Their names preserved in seed syllables. Their fates marked not in history, but in ritual. In ancient Vedic chant traditions, these lost lands are symbolized not by narrative, but by vibration. Each syllable was said to correspond to a realm, and when spoken in sequence, they traced the fall of time. Who knew that in the 21st century, satellite altimetry and seismic tomography might give unexpected weight to chants once dismissed as devotional abstraction? But the whispers don't end there. In 2005, Japanese marine biologists publishing on cetacean migration noted an anomaly. Sperm whales navigating the southern Indian Ocean displayed a peculiar behavior. They consistently lingered over a seemingly unremarkable stretch between Madagascar and Sri Lanka. No known feeding ground, no tectonic trench, just a featureless undersea plain. But when sonar scans were pulled, they revealed subtle but extensive ridges, straight, not natural, too symmetrical to be ignored. Biologists had no explanation, but linguistic anthropologists did. Ancient Austronesian navigation chants, especially those preserved in the Comoros Islands and the southern Maldives, refer to resting stones in the deep ocean. Not islands, stones. Invisible markers passed down by oral memory alone, used to guide ships long before the magnetic compass reached these shores. Is it possible that some of these undersea ridges are remnants of man-made structures? Or landforms above water only 10,000 years ago, when sea levels were drastically lower? At the height of the last glacial period, much of the Indian Ocean was 25 to 40 meters shallower. Vast coastal zones now flooded would have been habitable, possibly thriving. In a forgotten paper from 1932, Indian geologist T. Triloknath proposed a radical idea that the Nirmada Sun lineament, a geological fault stretching across central India, was once connected to a tectonic belt extending into the Mascarene Basin. His work, buried in old journals, hinted at a fracture system linking modern-day India to submerged terrain now lost. Though dismissed by the emerging plate tectonics orthodoxy in later decades, modern seismic data have revalidated parts of his analysis. The ocean floor remembers in waves and cracks. So what lived on that land before it cracked? Here the silence grows thick. Fossil records are difficult to retrieve from submarine contexts, but trace indicators remain. Micromagnetic anomalies, mineral compositions, and sediment layering suggest that parts of the Indian Ocean floor were above water, well into the Holocene. And if they were almost certainly inhabited. No known human society, past or present, has ever ignored fertile coastal zones, especially in climates warm and monsoonal. Yet this is where archaeology stalls. The tools to excavate at such depths are limited. Funding is scarce, and the academic risk of being labeled a fringe theorist for daring to connect the dots is profound. So the questions remain underwater. But maybe the ocean is not the only archive. In the temples of southern India, specifically in Chidambaram, Tanjavur, and Kanchipuram, exist murals and inscriptions referencing land beyond the wind, a place of golden geometry where the first calendar was laid upon stone. The texts don't name Lemuria or Kumari Kandam, but they allude to a realm ruled by astronomer kings who aligned their cities not by conquest but by stars. In the Surya Siddhanta, a Sanskrit astronomical treatise composed during the Supta period but sourcing older material, are planetary constants and sign tables far too precise for their time. Some values for the revolution of the Earth and the Moon deviate from modern numbers by less than 1%. The text speaks of these calculations being inherited, not invented. From whom? Whose knowledge was passed, whispering through languages, into the pages of a 4th century manuscript. Maybe Lemuria, if it ever existed, was not a utopia. Maybe it was not a single culture but a convergence of proto-civilizations, trading, sailing, mapping, observing, each leaving fragments that would later reappear like ghosts in the sacred sciences of emerging empires. It is easy to dismiss it all. A sunken ridge here, a wayward chant there, a pattern in the stars that might be coincidence. But these fragments, when held side by side, begin to resemble something more than chance. They resemble a cartography, not of territory but of memory. A memory can be a ruin, not made of stone but of resonance, the kind that echoes in geometry, in mythic alignment, in the layout of ancient cities that seem, at first glance, unrelated, scattered across continents like dice thrown by time. But look closer, not at the walls but at the way shadows fall, not at the stones themselves but the way they are placed, as if responding to something above, not below. This is where the conversation shifts from geology to orientation, because orientation is not random. Ancient builders across cultures had obsessions with alignment, to solstices, to equinoxes, to stars no longer visible. Egypt, Peru, Cambodia, India, all across these geographies, ruins share an invisible language. It's not stylistic, it's mathematical. Take Dvaraka, off the coast of Gujarat, submerged beneath the Arabian Sea, lie the ruins of what may be one of India's oldest cities. For decades they were dismissed as legend, described in the Mahabharata as the Golden Kingdom of Lord Krishna, sunk beneath the waves in a moment of divine wrath. But in 2001, after sonar scans and diving expeditions, marine archaeologists confirmed the presence of man-made structures lying at depths and alignments inconsistent with natural formations. Pavements, columns, a grid. What startled them was not just the precision, but the orientation, northwest to southeast, mirroring celestial movement during the Holocene epoch. The alignment didn't match any known temple or palace structure from later Indian history. It resembled something older, much older. The same directional logic appears in temple blueprints from Tamil Nadu. In Brihadiswara Temple, built over 1,000 years ago but preserving older design principles, the inner sanctum is not oriented due east as expected. It's slightly tilted, calculated precisely to receive the sun's rays only on certain days of the year, days that no longer match our current solstices. Either the builders made an error, or the earth or the calendar shifted. Or perhaps they were preserving a memory of an older sky. Astronomical orientation is not mere architecture, it is archive, especially when that archive extends beyond the land, beyond the present. Let's return to the ocean. The submerged structures at Pumbuhar, those at Dvaraka, even the debated terraces off Yanaguni, all display geometries that align not to coastlines but to heavens. Why would pre-modern societies, building with no access to satellite views or modern surveying equipment, take such pains to anchor their structures to star positions? Unless they were doing something more than worship, unless they were tracking something. There's an ancient Tamil text, the Tolkappiyam, generally regarded as the oldest work of Tamil grammar. But embedded within its linguistics are passing references to sky watchers, those who read the tides of heaven and who record the movement of the lion in the dark. Scholars typically gloss over these lines, seeing them as poetic flourishes. But consider this. During the period when Lemuria is mythically said to have existed, somewhere between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, the constellation Leo, the lion, would have occupied a significant position during equinox sunrises. This is not astrology. It is precession. The Earth wobbles as it spins, an axial precession that takes roughly 26,000 years to complete. As it does, the background stars that mark the sun's position during equinoxes slowly shift. Ancient sky watchers, those in Egypt, in Sumer, in the Indus, knew this. They encoded it into temples, into sphinxes, into myths of shifting ages. In Vedic cosmology, it is called the Yuga cycle. And this is where it gets stranger. The Vedic texts describe for great yugas, epochs of rising and falling consciousness. According to the Vishnu Purana, humanity is currently in Kali Yuga, the age of decline. But before that came Dvapara, Treta, and at the beginning Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. The timeline of these yugas stretches back tens of thousands of years, far beyond what orthodox history allows. And yet their durations, when plotted against axial precession, match with uncanny closeness. What if the yuga cycles weren't myth? What if they were a chronometric system, a memory of astronomical time? What if Lemuria, whatever its physical form, was not only a land but a calendar, a civilization that measured not years or reigns but the great breadth of the cosmos? Because that's what myths do. They encode cycles, floods and fires, golden ages and iron declines. They all move to rhythms we've forgotten how to hear. Perhaps Lemuria wasn't lost in a day. Perhaps it drowned across centuries, watching its own sunrises slip out of sync with the stars. And maybe that's why every surviving reference to it, whether as Kumarikandam or the southern land of the Cetus, speaks of knowledge, not conquest. Observation, not empire. Temples turned to observatories. Poets as record keepers. Myths as algorithms of celestial memory. And then silence. The question is no longer, did Lemuria exist? Is this who still remembers how to read the sky the way they did? The sky isn't the only thing that remembers. Sometimes it's the ground, especially the ground we've forgotten to dig. In the Nilgiri hills of southern India, where mist weaves through eucalyptus groves and the scent of wet soil clings to every stone, a strange kind of silence reigns. Not the absence of noise, but the density of something unsaid. Archaeologists working in these highlands have long catalogued megalithic dolmens and burial sites. Stone chambers covered in moss, often with no clear origin. They're typically dated to around 1000 BCE and assigned to Iron Age tribal cultures. But some of the formations don't fit the pattern. They sit at odd orientations, in clusters that hint at pattern, not chance. In 2012, a field survey from the Archaeological Survey of India noted that several dolmen sites across the Nilgiris displayed magnetic anomalies, readings that spiked compasses off-axis by several degrees. The soil composition couldn't explain it. Neither could nearby mineral deposits. One researcher, publishing anonymously in a fringe but peer-reviewed journal, proposed a different theory. The stones were part of an archaic geodetic grid, a terrestrial counterpart to astronomical alignment. A map on the Earth, not of it. It's an idea echoed elsewhere. In Madagascar, on the western coast near Morondava, similar dolmens, called Vatalahi, or stones of the ancestors, stand alone, without inscription, but often in lines that trace solar paths. Local oral traditions speak of sky people, who once measured both sun and sea, and who sailed without sails until the sea took them. Again the sea. What begins as coincidence becomes rhythm. Dolmens, alignments, oral traditions, all circling the same paradox. Why do so many ancient cultures, geographically isolated and linguistically distinct, share the idea that knowledge, true, sacred, technical knowledge, came from a people now gone, often described as both human and not? This is where we touch something dangerous, because to suggest that early civilizations possessed knowledge beyond what we credit them is to tread the boundary between academic skepticism and cultural memory. And yet, the evidence continues to murmur. Take the site of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, dated to around 9600 BCE. Predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years, it features megalithic pillars engraved with animals, celestial symbols, and abstract forms. It appeared fully formed, with no clear developmental stages, no tools, no villages, no signs of agricultural buildup. Just knowledge carved in stone, as if memory had descended whole into human hands. Göbekli Tepe is an anomaly, but anomalies don't exist in isolation. They are often the tip of submerged structures, literal or intellectual. What if it wasn't unique? What if there were other centers of early sky-based culture, now lost beneath rising seas or overwritten by later empires? Lemuria, in this sense, becomes a conceptual bridge, not just between continents, but between phases of memory, between the time when humans lived with the sky and the time we forgot how. In Tamil Siddha tradition, a lineage of mystics and alchemists dating back thousands of years, the sea is not merely water. It is kalapu, a term with layered meanings: chaos, churning, transformation. The sea doesn't destroy, it refines. It returns knowledge not in words, but in symbols, in dreams, in fragments. The Siddhas speak of flood-born truth, insights that come only after everything familiar has been erased. That phrase appears in palm leaf manuscripts held deep within Tamil monasteries, some still untranslated, others deliberately hidden. One such text, known only by its opening verse, Aranmoji Theorem, describes an island civilization where stone became breath and night carried weight. Scholars argue over metaphor, but what if it wasn't metaphor at all? What if they were describing buildings attuned to vibration, structures built not just with stone but into stone, resonant architectures that responded to the earth itself? In modern acoustic engineering, we understand how frequencies can shape material behavior: sound levitation, resonant vibration, cymatics. But are these modern rediscoveries of principles once encoded in myth? In 1997, a team from the Indian Institute of Technology studying the acoustic properties of South Indian temples discovered that certain mantapas, pillared halls, produced harmonic resonances when struck at specific intervals. The frequency ranges, when analyzed, matched with natural earth frequencies, especially those associated with Schumann resonance bands. Most dismissed it as coincidence, but others whispered of tuning. Tuning what? Maybe not just temples. Maybe minds or time. Across the ocean, on Easter Island, the Rapa Nui myths tell of builders of breath, those who moved stone by speaking to it. Mainstream archaeology scoffs, but the island's Moai statues, carved from volcanic tuff, have center-of-mass balances so precise they could be rocked upright and walked into place. The technique was only recently replicated with modern physics. Yet the Rapa Nui preserved the principle orally for centuries. Echoes again. Structures that sing. Stones that move. Myths that repeat across water, across language, across time. And at the center of this spiral, Lemuria looms, not as a single event or place, but as an axis. A memory turning in and out of visibility. A fulcrum of forgotten knowledge that left traces in acoustics, in architecture, in alignments, and in the way we once told time by the stars. Maybe that's why, in every culture touched by the Indian Ocean, there exists a name not for land, but for a lost sound. The sound that came before the flood. What was it? In the beginning, there was no word, only vibration. Or so said the Siddhars, the ancient mystics of Tamil Nadu. Long before Vedic chants codified cosmic order, before Sanskrit sutras gave shape to metaphysics, the Siddhars believed the universe was woven not from matter, but from tone. They spoke of nada, the primal sound, neither spoken nor heard but felt. A frequency at the root of all manifestation. They didn't worship it, they worked with it. Among the few palm leaf manuscripts still preserved in the cryptic Tamil Nadu libraries, one in particular stands apart, not for its theology, but for its geometry. Known as the Nada Mandala, it is a circular diagram comprised of nested rings, each filled with ancient syllables, not letters but bija sounds. These weren't meant to be read. They were to be uttered in sequence like a tuning key. What they unlocked was never explicitly stated, only hinted. When the breath and the stone are one, the sky will fold. For centuries, scholars have dismissed such diagrams as esoteric curiosities, the fevered dreams of mystics. But in 2015, an audioarchaeologist, yes, that's a real discipline now, named Dr. Shalini Raghavan, conducted an experiment at the ruined site of Korkai, once an ancient port and believed by some to be one of the last surviving edges of Lemuria. She reconstructed the syllabic sequences from the Nada Mandala, then played their frequencies through directional speakers inside a surviving granite chamber. The walls responded not with echoes, but with modulation. The frequency of the room shifted. The stone, it seemed, remembered how to vibrate. This wouldn't be remarkable except the chamber wasn't built for speech. It was subterranean, with no windows, no religious iconography, and no burial indicators. Its function has never been satisfactorily explained, unless, of course, it wasn't meant for the living or the dead, but for resonance. This is where Lemuria re-enters, not as land, but as a tonal architecture, an organizing principle of sound, space, and time. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe it wasn't a place that vanished, but a frequency we forgot how to hear. Yet the echoes persist, in the songs of tribal navigators, in the drone of didgeridoos, in the spiral harmonics of Tibetan gongs and South Indian jalatarangams. Across the Indian Ocean world, instruments emerged not to produce melody, but to shape space, to create acoustic environments that altered perception. This wasn't entertainment. It was orientation, calibration. Some call it music, others call it memory. Now consider this. In Madagascar's Antandroy community, elders passed down trumba songs, low, rhythmic chants said to summon ancestral presences from the ocean. These rituals don't take place on land. They happen on beaches, facing east. And though the community speaks Malagasy, some of the chant syllables bear unmistakable phonetic overlap with ancient Tamil root words, ka, ma, ra, na, the same syllables that appear in Nadamandala, the same phonemes used in temple mantras thousands of miles away. Coincidence? Possibly. But language rarely forgets what culture buries. Dravidian linguistics has long puzzled scholars. Tamil, the most enduring of the family, is a language without a clear ancestral tree. It seems to have appeared fully formed by 500 BCE, with a poetic sophistication rivaling Homer. The Sangam literature, composed during this early period, speaks of drowned cities, lost lands, and maritime kingdoms, whose names appear nowhere else in recorded history. Most academics attribute this to literary imagination. But what if imagination was the only tool left when memory lost its coordinates? Because here's the quiet crisis of human history. Every coastal civilization older than 10,000 years is, by default, underwater. Sea levels have risen over 400 feet since the last ice age ended. The real cathedrals of the deep past lie beneath silt and silence. We have never excavated them. We may never get the chance. And yet some knowledge survives not in bones or tools, but in patterns, in orientation, in vibration. In 2021, satellite interferometry, used to detect subtle gravitational anomalies on the ocean floor, revealed an unexpected cluster of symmetrical indentations off the coast of Sri Lanka. They were roughly rectangular, spaced evenly, and aligned along a northeast axis. Not enough to draw conclusions, but enough to ask a forbidden question. Did someone build there before the water came? The sea doesn't answer, but it also doesn't lie. It remembers in geometry. The Siddhars taught that all knowledge was cyclical, that everything lost would someday return, but never in the same form. Not cities, not continents, but frequencies, symbols, resonances carried forward through song, stone, and story. Maybe Lemuria, then, was not destroyed. Maybe it was transcribed, encoded not in texts, but in tones. A civilization that understood sound not as expression, but as structure, architecture in air. So when the sea came, what was lost was not just land, but the knowledge of how to hear the world itself. The question now is not how Lemuria was lost. It's whether we'd recognize it if it were speaking to us right now. There is a silence that feels heavy, like weight pressing in from forgotten ages. In 2004, the Indian Ocean tsunami rolled across the coasts with the blunt force of myth. Whole villages were wiped away in minutes. But when the sea retreated, just for a moment, it revealed something that hadn't seen sunlight in centuries. Off the coast of Mahabalipuram, beachgoers watched in stunned silence as the water peeled back to expose long-submerged temples, walls, and sculptures. Stone elephants, partially buried in silt, stood as if frozen mid-step. Ornate carvings, worn by time, became visible for hours before the sea took them again. Locals weren't surprised. For generations, the fishermen of Mahabalipuram had spoken of the 7 pagodas, a cluster of ancient temples, only one of which remained visible. The others, they said, had been taken by the ocean. Historians dismissed it as folklore. But the 2004 tsunami gave the myth teeth. The stones were real. The carvings were real. What else was? In the aftermath, marine archaeologists descended. The Archaeological Survey of India, along with international teams, mapped the area. Sonar revealed large stone blocks arranged in linear and circular formations, too consistent for geology, too aligned for randomness. Some were dated cautiously to before 1500 BCE. Others were left undated, their origins too unclear. It was a glimpse, not proof, but enough to suggest that the ocean floor hides stories older than history. The ocean does not erase. It entombs. And this brings us to a larger silence, not physical but intellectual. The silence of omission, of things deliberately left out of textbooks. Consider this. The first references to a southern landmass beneath India appeared not in fiction, but in early naturalist journals. In 1858, Samuel P. Woodward, a British geologist, published a paper suggesting that certain fossil similarities between India, Madagascar, and Africa required the existence of a submerged bridge. He didn't call it Lemuria, but others would. By the 1860s, Lemuria was a serious hypothesis, not mystical but geological. Then tectonic theory came and Lemuria was swept away, not disproven, but absorbed into a new paradigm. No one denied that something once connected the regions. They simply called it something else. A drift, a split, a shelf. Lemuria was discarded not because it was wrong, but because it no longer fit the language of the new science. That's how history forgets, not with denial, but with renaming. But while science moved on, culture remembered. In 1930s, Sri Lanka, a Sinhalese monk named Venerable Vimaladharma began collecting coastal chants from fishing communities. He believed they preserved older cosmologies. One chant, recorded near Mathera, described a city under sapphire light where the sea sang at the temple gates. The language was archaic, laced with Pali and Tamil roots. But the imagery was unmistakable. A submerged city whose rhythms continued in the tides. Vimaladharma's work was never translated into English. His recordings, pressed on wax cylinders, now sit in a climate-controlled vault in Colombo. Few have heard them, fewer understand them, but those who do note a pattern. The same directional metaphors, the same reverence for the ocean as both giver and taker of memory. And always the sound. The sea is not silent. It hums. It carries low frequencies, subsonic vibrations that travel for thousands of miles. In 1997, NOAA researchers recorded an unusual sound near the southern Indian Ocean. It lasted for over a minute. It resembled no known seismic event. They named it the bloop, a soft term for something they couldn't explain. While most now attribute it to ice calving, some acoustic analysts off-record disagreed. The bloop was too rhythmic, too structured. What if, somewhere below, the earth wasn't groaning, but remembering? We're taught to think of memory as a neural event, chemical, internal. But ancient cultures did not limit memory to the mind. Memory lived in stones, in stories, in water, in ritual. A temple was not just a place of worship. It was a mnemonic engine, a map to retain cosmology, orientation to encode time, vibration to hold presence, which brings us back to Lemuria, not as a continent but as a cognitive model. A way of remembering not just what was lost, but how to survive loss itself. The Tamil concept of Maripu captures this. It means tradition, but not in the passive sense. It implies embodied remembrance, the act of preserving through living, through doing, through singing. In this framework, Lemuria may never have needed to be proven. It was felt, known in the bones, sung by grandmothers, carved in floor patterns, etched in the angle of steps leading nowhere. And what of the steps? In temple ruins across southern India, archaeologists have found staircases that descend, not into crypts or wells, but into nothing. Staircases ending mid-air or disappearing into the ground. No practical purpose, no clear symbolic meaning. But the placement is deliberate, always oriented to the southeast, always built into structures that predate formal dynastic records. What if they were once connected to structures no longer there? Or better, what if they were meant for rising tides? Architectural adaptation to water is not new. The Indus Valley civilization built their cities with graded streets and brick-lined drains, suggesting a sensitivity to hydrological change. But the structures near the southern coast show a different relationship. Not one of defense, but of cooperation. As if the builders knew the sea would come, and built not to resist but to outlast. This reframes the myth. Lemuria was not destroyed. It receded, like a tide, taking with it the structures too proud to bend, leaving behind those wise enough to let go. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Not what was lost, but how loss was carried. In silence, in staircases, in chants nobody sings anymore. But what if we did? There's a peculiar map in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Catalogued without ceremony, It sits among hundreds of early European maritime charts. But unlike its companions, this one does not depict trade routes or coastlines. Dated to the early 1500s and attributed anonymously, likely a Portuguese cartographer, it shows something else entirely. A jagged landmass stretching between modern-day Madagascar and the southern tip of India, labeled in Latin as Terra Incognita Submersa, the submerged unknown land. No one knows the source of the map. There are no records of an expedition, no corresponding logbooks. Most scholars consider it speculative, a ghost echo of Ptolemaic cartography or medieval fables. But its contours are too deliberate, too specific. And oddly, they align, not with modern coastlines, but with the bathymetric ridges of the Mascarene Plateau, a place now under thousands of feet of water. When satellite oceanography became precise enough to measure these features in the late 20th century, the map was re-examined. The match wasn't perfect, but close enough to suggest that the cartographer was referencing something. Perhaps not from exploration, but from oral memory. Portuguese sailors were notorious for gathering local stories along their colonial routes. What if this submerged land was not imagined, but remembered? Passed down by Tamil navigators or Arab traders who heard tales from the fishermen of Kanyakumari. The map remains unverified, but it whispers the same truth every stone, every chant, every flood myth has been circling. Lemuria might not have been lost all at once. It may have disappeared slowly, cartographically, linguistically, spiritually, over centuries, erased layer by layer until only traces remained. Traces like the URU boats of Kerala. Still made today in the Bipur shipyards, these massive wooden vessels are constructed entirely without blueprints. The knowledge is passed from master builder to apprentice through touch, rhythm, and intuition. The design, curiously, resembles no modern vessel. Its hulls are rounded, its body low and wide, ideal not for the open ocean, but for island navigation through shallow seas. These ships bear an uncanny resemblance to the ancient catamaran vessels depicted in Sangam-era poetry, used to reach lands where the moon rises beneath the waves. What does that even mean? Poetry always stretches truth, but sometimes it stretches towards something that used to be real. In the Maldives, local lore describes sunken cities south of their current atolls, cities whose spires could be seen from the surface on moonlit nights. Western oceanographers dismiss this as reflection, illusion, but divers have occasionally reported seeing symmetrical rock formations on the seafloor in the Harunmathai Atoll. No one has excavated. The currents are too strong. The funding never comes. Maybe that's the point. The archaeology of Lemuria is not a question of tools, but of will. Because to excavate Lemuria is to unearth a narrative we're not ready for. That civilization may not have started in one place, but many. That the idea of firsts, first city, first language, first religion is a colonial hangover. A need to control history through linearity. Lemuria, if anything, suggests simultaneity. A network of cultures dispersed across what are now drowned coasts, connected not by empire, but by observation. Stars, tide, story. And it suggests another heresy, that memory does not degrade. It migrates. In Polynesian navigation traditions, the stars are not fixed. They move with the canoe. Orientation becomes a relationship, not a constant. The sea, then, is not a barrier but a surface of continuity, a place to remember while moving. And perhaps that's how Lemuria survived. Not in ruins or bones, but in drift, in boats, in chance, in the subtle curve of hulls made for a world that no longer exists. In 2009, a group of ethno-astronomers from the University of Hawaii recorded chants from Tamil fishing communities on the Coromandel coast. One verse, sung during full moon voyages, refers to a line of fire rising from the water's edge. When mapped against celestial data, the chant aligns perfectly with the heliacal rising of Sirius 10,000 years ago. Why would a contemporary song contain astronomical data no longer visible? Because it was preserved, not as science but as sound. This isn't unique. The Dogon of Mali, thousands of miles away, have oral knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star invisible to the naked eye and not identified by Western astronomy until 1862. The Dogons say they've always known. Critics call it coincidence or contamination, but the parallels grow harder to dismiss. And this is what makes Lemuria so unsettling. It doesn't ask to be believed. It asks to be heard. Not as myth, but as mnemonic. A buried pattern. One that surfaces in temples, in boat design, in sky lore, in inexplicable maps tucked into old archives. One that connects Tamil Sangam poetry with Malagasy syntax. Vedic mantras with gravitational anomalies. Chant with stone. Flood with fire. And if all these fragments are truly unrelated, why do they all point south? Why do they all whisper towards the same submerged horizon? And why, after centuries of forgetting, do we still hear them calling? Sometimes, the absence of something is louder than its presence. In 1938, an unassuming German philologist named Wilhelm Koppers published a dense monograph cataloging the mythologies of tribal cultures across South India. Buried deep in his appendix was a short entry, barely a paragraph, documenting a creation tale from the Irula people of the Nilgiris. It spoke of a time when the mountains had no name and the sky was closer to the ground. In this time, the story went, people could speak across the sea using only breath. There were no boats, no fire, only wind, sound, and a vast, flat land where the night never fully came. Koppers offered no interpretation. He noted the myth's striking divergence from typical Indo-Aryan cosmology and moved on. But something about the phrasing, the night never fully came, lingered. Not darkness, but twilight, an eternal blue. Modern astronomers, when calculating ancient axial tilt patterns and Earth's precessional wobble, discovered that regions in the equatorial belt, particularly just below the southern tip of India, would have experienced unusually extended twilight periods during certain epochs, especially near the Younger Dryas boundary around 10,800 BCE. A time when global climates shifted abruptly. A time of floods, extinctions, and perhaps civilizational resets. Was the Irula myth a faint echo of the sky? And if so, what else did they remember? Language carries fragments, even in simple words. In Tamil, one of the oldest continuously spoken languages, the word for ocean, kadal, does not simply mean water. It also connotes memory. Kadal Nanavu is not ocean recollection. It is deep memory, the kind that is difficult to retrieve, yet impossible to erase. Linguists might call it metaphor, but in oral cultures, metaphors are vaults. They store what writing cannot. In the Maldives, the Divhai language contains a word, Fandita. It refers to a kind of esoteric knowledge, not quite magic, not quite science, that navigates between wind, wave, and moon. Practitioners of Fandita were said to be able to sense submerged lands, not through maps, but through water tension, pressure, vibration, echoes beneath the hull. Sailors once believed in such people. Then maps became flat, borders rigid, and the sea stopped speaking. But the sea had already told them everything. In 2016, a British marine geophysicist named Dr. Eleanor Lawton conducted a high-resolution seismic survey of the Lacative Ridge, a submerged mountain range trailing south of India like a spine. Most of it lies between 1,000 and 3,000 meters below sea level. But what her team discovered was unexpected. Sediment layering patterns inconsistent with the rest of the seabed. Areas where the strata were fractured, not by tectonics, but by what appeared to be surface exposure. In simpler terms, parts of the ridge had once been land. She published cautiously, suggested post-volcanic uplift and rapid submersion events, perhaps during meltwater pulses around 12,000 years ago. She didn't use the word civilization. That would have been academic suicide. But in interviews, she admitted that there may have been periods when this terrain was dry, accessible, and potentially occupied. Potentially occupied. 2 words, buried in a footnote, but enough to reframe everything. Because if even part of the Lacative Ridge had breached the surface, it would have stretched as a continuous landform connecting southern India with the Chagos-Lacative Plateau. An expanse now lost, but once vast enough to cradle rivers, lakes, and perhaps memory. Memory not of myths, but of calendars. The yuga cycles of Vedic cosmology are often dismissed for their implausible durations, thousands upon thousands of years. But these cycles aren't meant to align with human life. They track cosmic time, and more specifically, they encode axial precession, the slow 26,000-year wobble of Earth's tilt. Ancient builders across the globe somehow grasped this. At Angkor Wat, at Teotihuacan, at Nabta Playa, astronomical alignments mark solstices and equinoxes with precessional precision. Why would pre-modern societies care about slow sky drift unless they'd watched it change? And to watch it change, they'd need deep time, deep continuity, deep memory. Lemuria, in this context, becomes a hypothesis not of land, but of observation. A civilization that mapped long cycles, that passed down the knowledge not through books, but through ritual. Temples aligned with sunrise angles no longer relevant, chance time to star risings no longer visible. A living calendar, etched into architecture, into language, into breath. Which brings us once more to sound. Recent research in archaeoacoustics, the study of how ancient spaces were designed to interact with sound, has found that megalithic sites in both South India and Madagascar share an acoustic feature. Prolonged reverberation at specific frequencies between 90 Hz and 120 Hz. These frequencies correspond to deep vocal resonance, human chant range. But more curiously, they also align with natural Earth resonance frequencies, so-called Schumann resonances, created by electromagnetic activity between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Why would pre-modern builders shape spaces to resonate with the Earth itself? Unless they were trying to harmonize, not metaphorically, literally. Temples as tuning forks, chants as synchronization, civilization not as conquest, but as coherence. This is the heresy of Lemuria, that once there may have been a culture more interested in harmony than dominion, more focused on listening than naming, a society built not upon hierarchy but on frequency, and perhaps that is why it disappeared. because such civilizations leave no conquest trails, no kings, no epics of blood. Only alignments, stones, songs, and stories we mistake for dreams. But what if it wasn't a dream? What if somewhere beneath our modern noise, the frequency still waits? Every now and then, history leaves behind a footprint too large to ignore, and yet so out of place that it becomes invisible. In 1976, French geologist Maurice Ewing, while leading an oceanographic survey near the southwest Indian Ridge, published a series of bathymetric maps indicating unusually shallow seamount structures arranged in a roughly linear fashion. At the time, tectonic theory was still consolidating global consensus, and Ewing's work was primarily focused on plate movement. But deep in his notes, archived and rarely cited, was a short observation. There appears to be an unnatural symmetry to this feature, reminiscent of submerged terraces or man-made steps. No photos were included. The equipment was crude by today's standards. The phrase was left unexplained. Submerged terraces, man-made steps, thousands of meters beneath the surface. Of course, no one followed up. Funding rarely favors anomalies, and the Indian Ocean has never been the darling of deep-sea archaeology. Too vast, too dangerous, too far from the narratives that grant prestige. But what if Ewing saw something? Fast forward nearly 4 decades. In 2012, satellite altimetry used to measure gravity anomalies, tiny variations in Earth's mass, detected subtle ridgelines running parallel to those seamounts. When plotted three-dimensionally, the topography resembled not natural volcanic formations but leveled platforms. Massive, drowned mesas extending for miles. Not jagged like tectonic scars, but smooth, layered, sculpted, and the alignment, roughly along 8 degrees south latitude. A band that astronomically aligns with solar zeniths during equinoxes in the precessional cycle roughly 11,000 years ago. Why would the ocean floor remember the equinox? Unless someone had marked it. Ancient cultures didn't just observe the sky. They built with it, across the world. From Machu Picchu to Angkor, from the Great Pyramids to the Nabta Playa Circle. Architecture followed heaven. But beyond the monuments and temples, there was another kind of orientation. The grid. Grid planning is not modern. Excavations of Mohenjo-Daro reveal a mathematically precise city plan over 4,000 years old. Streets laid in right angles. Drainage systems aligned with cardinal directions. But older still, in southern India, the layout of village compounds, especially the Agrahara or Brahmin quarters, followed Vastushastra, a design philosophy that mapped human dwellings to cosmic order. It dictated not just where to build, but when, how, and in resonance with what planetary rhythm. Now imagine this, not on land but at sea. What if Lemuria wasn't a single city or temple, but an entire geodetic complex? A sacred geography, extending across now-drowned plateaus, bound not by walls, but by alignment, by intention. It's not impossible. Indigenous knowledge systems across the Indian Ocean basin suggest a spatial awareness far beyond practical navigation. In the Lakshadweep Islands, for example, traditional seafarers speak of shadow lines, not visible paths, but alignments felt through sky and wave, passed down without maps. The term Nilavati, literally blue pathway, refers to a direction discerned by moonlight and tidal tone. And when those same directions are traced on satellite maps, they correspond uncannily to submerged geological formations. Not precisely, but not randomly either. We're used to explaining ancient sophistication with necessity. People navigated because they had to. They watched the sky because it told them when to plant. But what if the motivation wasn't just survival? What if it was stewardship? Lemuria, in its most poetic recollection, was not a kingdom, but a balance. A civilization so attuned to planetary rhythms that it understood time not as a calendar, but as a pattern. A civilization that may have mapped the sea floor not to conquer it, but to honor it. Which brings us to the coral. In 2020, marine ecologists studying deep-sea coral reefs near the Mascarene Basin discovered growth anomalies, rings within coral structures that suggested stable, shallow water environments as recently as 9,000 years ago. Coral cannot survive in deep cold. These anomalies indicated rapid submergence events, fast enough to alter ecosystems, slow enough to trap memory. They also found something else, coral arrangements that did not follow natural reef curves. Instead, they arced into near-circular formations suggestive of enclosures or boundaries. Not proof, but a whisper. It's the same whisper heard in the chants of the Siddhars. The same one echoed in Malagasy lullabies, in Sri Lankan beach hymns, in the symmetrical scars left on ocean floors. No one visits. A memory not of what we lost, but of how we once listened. Because that's the difference. Lemuria, if it existed, may not have been defined by buildings or warfare or dynasties. It may have been defined by a quality of attention, a capacity to hold sky, sea, sound, and silence as part of the same continuum. And that kind of memory, once broken, is not easily recovered. It reemerges in dreams, in rituals whose meanings have been forgotten, but whose forms persist. In the curved doorway of a Tamil home, aligned to a sunrise no longer visible. In the position of stones in a neglected temple courtyard, tracing an equinox that passed 10,000 years ago. In a line of submerged seamounts, mistaken for nothing. But maybe, just maybe, meant for everything. So now we must ask, if we are beginning to hear the frequency again, are we ready for what it might tell us? The land doesn't need to speak. The way it folds is already language. On the southern coast of Sri Lanka, just east of Dandrahead, the island's southernmost tip, there lies an almost invisible contour in the terrain. A gentle curve, not dramatic enough to be called a ridge, but too persistent to be dismissed as erosion. It hugs the coastline like a shadow of something long gone. Locals call it the sleeping tongue, not for its shape but for its quiet. Nothing grows there properly. Rainwater drains faster. Birds do not nest. Even animals avoid it. And though modern maps say it's nothing, stories say otherwise. According to fishermen in the Madura district, the tongue marks the edge of a forgotten city, a place where, long ago, the sea rose not in waves, but in silence. Not a flood, a lifting. The ground, they say, tilted upward, as if inhaling. Then the sea came to meet it. No scream, no collapse, only a breath, and then stillness. When asked how this story has survived, one elder only smiled and said, "Because we still fish above it." Above what? There are sonar maps, obscure ones, released by a private geological firm contracted for undersea cable planning in 2006. They show anomalies, sharp 90-degree angles in formations lying just off the coast. Geometries too precise for coral, too straight for lava flow. But no further studies followed. The data wasn't classified. It was ignored because it didn't fit. And that's the pattern, isn't it? Lemuria exists in the gaps between classifications, between disciplines, between what we're allowed to ask and what we secretly suspect. It doesn't shout. It hums, like certain stones in South India's older temples, pillars that, when struck, emit a tone. Not just resonance, but pitch, specific, tuned. The sound is not incidental. It is built into the design. And in some temples, these tones form scales. In the Veerbhadra temple in Lapakshi, the hanging pillars produce musical intervals when tapped. In Tanjavure's Brihadaswar temple, the steps leading to the sanctum echo at fixed frequencies. Musicians who've tested them note a scale that matches the ancient grama system, the Vedic musical mode, said to be derived from the tonal ratios of planetary orbits. How would a temple built 1,000 years ago echo planetary motion? Unless it was preserving something much older. Sound has memory. That's why we cry at songs we didn't know we remembered. That's why lullabies cross oceans. And it's why certain languages carry syllables that make no immediate sense, but feel heavy with inheritance. In Tamil, the word olai means both leaf and wave. In Sanskrit, smrti means memory, but its root shares lineage with svara, tone. In the Polynesian language of Rapa Nui, the word for ancient knowledge, maneo, is also the word for thought. In every one of these, knowledge is not static. It moves. It breathes. It vibrates. Could it be that Lemuria was never meant to be a place, but a waveform? A cultural resonance that once found form in land, and then, when the sea came, in sound? There's evidence if you know where to listen. In Madagascar, linguists have traced Austronesian migration patterns by tracking rhyme structures in oral storytelling. Certain meter forms, 4-beat cadences, alternating tonal stress, match precisely with structures in old Tamil epics. Not meaning, not vocabulary, but rhythm. That rhythm doesn't migrate by accident. It survives because it is encoded in bodies, in breath, in the time between words. And when we forget the words, the rhythm remains. In temples, that rhythm becomes architecture. In chants, it becomes invocation. In movement, it becomes dance. The Karana gestures of ancient Indian classical dance, documented in the Natya Shastra, mirror star patterns. Not metaphorically, literally. The positions correspond to constellations during the vernal equinox of 11,000 years ago. Why would dancers encode sky maps unless they were once navigators, once architects, once rememberers? Which brings us back to Lemuria, not as a fantasy, but as a framework. A civilizational model not based on cities, borders, or empire, but on harmonic preservation. A distributed memory system, part land, part sound, part star. Something that, once drowned, became myth, not because it was less real, but because it was no longer readable like a book in a forgotten script, or a song sung in the wrong key. In recent years, a new field has emerged: cultural seismology. Scholars in this space attempt to map traumatic environmental shifts in ancient cultures, not through fossil record, but through mythic inversion. Stories that flip known patterns to signal disruption. One example comes from the Tamil Akananaru, a classical anthology of poems. In several verses, the poet speaks of the moon rising from the south and the mountain weeping into the sea. These are impossible images, but when viewed through the lens of Earth, tilt, and axial shift, they become eerily plausible. There was a time when the pole stars were not where they are now. When Vega, not Polaris, pointed north. When the moon's path traced arcs unfamiliar to our current sky. These changes take millennia, but a culture watching carefully, recording, would notice, and perhaps they would grieve. So what do we call that grief? A legend? A lie? Or simply a song that has lost its listener? Maybe Lemuria is not meant to be found beneath the sea. Maybe it's meant to be reconstructed in the space between fields, in the echo chambers of archaeology, linguistics, astronomy, and ritual. Maybe it isn't about discovery. It's about tuning. So we end, not with evidence, but with vibration. What if Lemuria was never buried? What if it's still vibrating? And we're the ones who went deaf? Some maps are not made to be read. They are meant to be walked. In the ancient temple town of Kanchipuram, the streets do not align with practicality. They bend, curve, loop in geometries that to the casual visitor seem chaotic. But from above, especially from a satellite's eye, they reveal a different logic, a spiral, a recursive pattern moving inward toward the sanctum of the Kailasanathar temple. A design that mirrors the golden ratio, the Fibonacci spiral, the recursive growth of nautilus shells. This isn't accidental, nor is it unique. Across South Asia, from Chidambaram to Madurai, ancient cities bear architectural fingerprints of mathematical principles far older than their dynastic foundations. They do not just house temples. They are temples. Urban centers laid out according to mandalas. Cosmograms meant not for conquest, but for consciousness. And yet, most modern maps erase this. They trace borders, rivers, roads, but never intention, never vibration, never myth. But the myths remain. Kanchipuram is said to be one of the 7 mokshapuras, cities where liberation is easier, where the cycle of rebirth becomes thin. That phrase is often dismissed as spiritual metaphor. But what if the city's geometry, its layout, its chant lines, its solar alignments, was designed to create a resonance? A psychospatial field that calibrated the human body like an instrument? And what if this wasn't just religious design, but a memory of something older, something drowned? Consider the Kumbhabhishekam ritual, performed every 12 years to recharge temple energies. The process is elaborate, precise. Chant, water, fire, geometry, breath, all orchestrated into harmonic sequence. But what's rarely asked is, recharge what? Stone or space? In 2008, researchers at the Indian Institute of Science placed seismographs near several South Indian temples during the Kumbhabhishekam. They recorded a subtle but measurable resonance shift in ground frequency, an anomalous local tremor pattern, too small to feel but distinct on instrumentation. It lasted for hours after the ritual ended. No tectonic activity, no external source. Just the stone, vibrating, remembering. That word again, remember. We treat memory as something locked in brains. But across ancient traditions, memory lives in place. In the Aboriginal Dreamtime, stories are mapped across the land in songlines, paths that must be sung to be navigated. In the Andean Seca system, sacred lines radiated from Cusco to maintain cosmic order. In the Vastu Purusha mandala, the house is a body and its layout determines karmic flow. And in the lost land of Lemuria, if the myths hold truth, entire cities may have been mapped to the stars not to worship them, but to mimic them. Not as above, so below, but as within, so without. This philosophy, echoed in Hermetic texts, in tantric diagrams, in Polynesian canoe rituals, points to a civilization that didn't separate the spatial. Every temple, every step, every chant was cartography. Not of land, but of time. Because what is time to a people who watched stars for millennia? Not a line, a cycle. In ancient Tamil cosmology, time is measured in yugas, great cycles that spiral through creation, preservation, and dissolution. But the dissolution is not an end, it is a return. Pralaya, the great flood, is not destruction, it is remembering. A reset, a submergence that clears what has become discordant, so harmony can be restored. And what does this sound like? Tuning, which brings us to the mystery of ritual acoustics. In 2021, an interdisciplinary team at the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage studied sonic resonance in pre-modern temples. Their findings were strange. Certain chants, when performed within specific architectural zones, triggered harmonic feedback loops, standing waves that lingered for minutes. The effect altered heart rates, slowed breath, synchronized brainwaves across multiple individuals. They weren't just chanting, they were syncing. And what if this was the function of Lemurian ritual? Not prayer, not appeasement, but entrainment. To align body, breath, and earth to the rhythm of the cosmos. Maybe that's why Lemuria disappears so easily from conventional history. It left no weapons, no gold, no palaces, only patterns, songs, and perhaps, at its deepest level, a philosophy. That harmony is infrastructure, that sacredness is geometry, that memory is spatial. And this philosophy did not vanish. It fractured. It migrated. Fragments of it live on in Tamil temple design, in Balinese water temples, in Easter Island's celestial moai alignments, in the Polynesian navigation chants that carry islands in their rhythm. Fragments that, when placed side by side, form a ghost grid. A map of a world we no longer see, but still feel, because you felt it too, in that hush before dawn, in the spiral of a shell, in the strange sense that certain places remember you, though you've never been there. That odd chill on stone steps, the way temples smell like time, the unshakable notion that the earth is not only alive, but aware. Perhaps that's what Lemuria was, a civilization that didn't forget the earth is listening, and built accordingly. So the question is not whether Lemuria was real, it's whether we still remember how to walk its map. It begins with a breath held too long. In the highlands of Kerala, nestled between forests and mist-laden ridges, lies a forgotten ritual known only to a handful of elder practitioners. The Nilavara Patu, or Song of the Cellar, is performed in silence. Not absence of sound, but silence structured by rhythm. A low beat is tapped on the floor with the heel measured steady. Then a chant, toneless, breathy, like wind through reed, is whispered into the darkness of an earthen storeroom. There's no audience, no shrine, no visible purpose. But when anthropologist Dr. Aisha Menon recorded the chant in 2014 and ran a spectrographic analysis, she found something no one expected. The frequency pattern of the chant mirrored the oscillations of subsonic tidal pulses recorded off India's western coast. Pulses too deep to hear, but perceptible through instruments. The song was syncing with the sea. The Nilavara, the hidden room, has long been a fixture of traditional Kerala homes. It's where grains are stored, pickles fermented, and ancestral memories whispered into the soil. But no one considered that these earthen rooms might be resonant chambers, not just for preservation, but for transmission, for tuning human presence to something deeper than daily time. What does this have to do with Lemuria? Everything, because the pattern appears again and again, in the structures of memory not explained by utility, in rituals whose function is not survival but attunement. Lemuria, if it was anything, might have been a civilization built not on permanence but precision. A society whose architecture was not designed to last forever, but to echo forever, to remain audible long after the walls had sunk. Audible to whom? Perhaps to us? But only if we remembered how to listen. This changes the meaning of ruin. We think of ruins as fragments, what's left behind. But what if they are not remains, but recordings? What if those ancient stone circles, terrace platforms, and submerged stairs are spatial notations in a script we no longer read? Not history carved in stone, but frequency made visible? Because Lemuria doesn't speak in straight lines. Curls, spirals, loops. In Tamil iconography, the spiral is sacred, found in column floor drawings, temple latticework, and the curl of Shiva's locks. Not decorative, mnemonic. The spiral signifies memory not as recollection, but as re-entry. You don't retrieve, you return, you don't ascend, you re-enter the pattern. And those patterns are everywhere. At the Temple of Rameswaram, whose very name means the Lord of Rama's Bridge, stone corridors stretch impossibly long, echoing footsteps in sequences that amplify and vanish depending on your pace. Sonic nodes, as if the builders tuned the very act of walking. The temple faces the sea, toward Adam's Bridge, a chain of limestone shoals connecting India to Sri Lanka, visible in satellite imagery. Geologists call it a natural formation. Local legends call it a remnant. A bridge once walked by gods, now sunken, but never silenced. In 2002, NASA satellite photos reignited debate about Adam's Bridge. The formation is roughly 30 kilometers long, mostly submerged, with shallow sandbanks and raised ridges. Could be natural, could be something else. In ancient Tamil texts, the structure is called Setu. And it's not just a bridge, it's a threshold, a boundary between what is visible and what is remembered. And that's where Lemuria lives, in thresholds, between continents, between tones, between myth and geology. It haunts the edges of things, linguistic anomalies, architectural impossibilities, navigational superstitions. It pulses just beneath the stories we dismiss as metaphor, like the story of the Siddhas, immortal seers who wandered the mountains of South India and flew across the seas using breath alone. Myth surely, but the texts describing them, the Tirumantaram, the Siddha Vaidya corpus, speak in pharmacological detail of breath control, sound harmonics, and magnetic fields. Their temples? Not opulent, remote, embedded in rock faces, tuned to magnetic ley lines. Many sit directly above ancient fault lines, which modern science now identifies as geomagnetic anomalies. Why would seers build on seismic lines? Unless they weren't building to withstand earthquakes, but to listen to them, to feel the deep pulse of the earth. This shifts the frame entirely. Lemuria is no longer a place you find. It's a pulse you notice, one that emerges in the strangest places. A child's lullaby that traces a star path lost for millennia. A ceremonial drum pattern that mirrors solar harmonics. A floor plan that becomes a calendar. A chant that syncs with the ocean's breath. And in the Mascarene Plateau, that vast, submerged shoulder beneath the Indian Ocean, those patterns persist. Bathymetric studies show stepped gradients. Terraced formations inconsistent with seafloor spreading. Structures that suggest, if only faintly, that someone once shaped them. Not to dominate but to attune. It's the opposite of empire. Empires leave bricks, weapons, laws. Lemuria left resonance. And that resonance is surfacing again. Not in monuments but in questions. Why do certain ancient languages encode mathematical ratios into their syntax? Why do the oldest known melodies mirror lunar cycles? Why does the Earth hum at 7.83 Hz, the same as the human alpha brainwave? And why did ancient structures seem to amplify this? Why do we feel something when we stand in certain temples? Not nostalgia, not faith. Something cellular. A memory without a name? Maybe that's the pulse Lemuria left behind. Not civilization, but coherence. Not story, but structure. And not a fall, but a fading. Like a breath held too long. Until now. Blood remembers, too. Not in language, not in architecture, but in patterns, buried deep in the double helix, where the songs of migration are written in silence. And sometimes they don't stay quiet. In 2010, a genomic study published in Nature sent quiet ripples through the field of population genetics. It revealed that a small group of indigenous peoples living along the southern coasts of India and Sri Lanka shared a unique haplogroup with certain tribal populations in eastern Madagascar and coastal Kenya. It wasn't a dominant marker. It wasn't proof of large-scale migration. But it was there. An echo. An echo of what? The paper framed it as unexpected genetic continuity across Indian Ocean rim populations, suggesting pre-Austronesian maritime contacts. An academically careful way of saying something connected these people long before history said it should have. Geneticists speak in probabilities, but culture carries certainty in its bones. The Malagasy people of Madagascar speak a language derived from Austronesian roots, but with a linguistic stratum that baffles scholars, Proto-Dravidian loanwords buried inside botanical and agricultural terminology. Not trade words, not conqueror words, domestic ones. Words for rice, for boat, for sky. Why would you borrow the word for sky? Unless your sky once belonged to someone else. Or unless you had carried it with you. This is not a new question. In the 19th century, French colonial linguists noted the odd affinity between Malagasy and Tamil syntax. They called it coincidence, the result of overlapping trade. But that explanation falls apart when you realize that even isolated hill tribes in Madagascar, far from ports, with no recorded Indian contact, speak with inflections shaped by tongues from 3,000 miles away. Something deeper happened. Something the sea buried. And this is where Lemuria re-enters. Not through myth, not through map, but through the body. The body remembers things the mind forgets. Muscle memory, genetic drift, morphological resonance. And when bodies move across vast distances, carrying seeds, rhythms, and ritual forms, they carry memory not as knowledge, but as impulse. Look at the column. This intricate form of geometric floor drawing, still practiced daily in Tamil households, uses rice flour to trace spirals and knots at the thresholds of homes. Each design is temporary, remade each dawn. It is not art. It is offering. But it is also instruction, mathematical algorithms of recursion, symmetry, and inversion. Children learn it before they can read. They trace loops. They don't ask why. Now look again at the petroglyphs of coastal Madagascar. Spirals, grids, inverted loops carved into stone with no known symbolic function. Different medium, same hand. It's a rhythm, a ritual, a code. One we forgot how to read because we separated art from math, ritual from architecture, memory from movement. But Lemuria, if it ever existed, seems to have lived in the space between those categories. Not a place, practice, not a kingdom, choreography, and perhaps that's why it left so little behind. Because what it left wasn't meant to endure in stone. It was meant to echo in the way we step, speak, breathe. In 2019, researchers mapping migratory music patterns through computational analysis discovered an unlikely anomaly. A shared rhythmic signature in the drumming of South Indian Parai traditions and the ceremonial Hazolahai drums of Madagascar's coastal rituals. The tempo, the beat structure, even the pause intervals. They matched. Drums do not lie. They carry cadence across water more faithfully than words. So maybe the people didn't sail from here to there or there to here. Maybe they belonged to something larger than both, a culture that moved with the tide, that scattered before the seas rise, that embedded memory not in cities, but in the way children learn to draw circles, in the pause between drum beats, in the chant you hum while weaving rope, because ropes remember too. In the islands of Lakshadweep, fishermen still use knot-counting methods to measure depth, tying specific knots at intervals along their lines, each one correlated to a rhythm, a word, a breath. These methods mirror techniques used by ancient Polynesian navigators, those who read waves by feel, who counted stars not as objects, but as pulses between gestures. No written instruction, only embodied inheritance. And what if that's what Lemuria was? Not a mythic Atlantis waiting to be found, but a neurological map. A distributed consciousness encoded in ritual, song, and structure. A culture that anticipated its own dissolution and prepared its memory not for permanence, but for migration. Because you cannot hold back the sea, but you can teach your children to carry the sky in their breath. And in that breath lies cartography. The Tamil word suji means spiral, but also trace and signature. The act of spiraling is the act of marking. The spiral isn't an aesthetic, it's a verb. You do it to remember. You do it to inscribe time into space. And when the land is gone, the spiral stays. Drawn in flower, sung in rhythm, buried in blood. So perhaps we've been looking in the wrong place all along. Searching the ocean floor for ruins, sonar maps for cities, DNA strands for conquest. But Lemuria was never about buildings. It was about memory. And memory, when properly tuned, moves. So the question we must now ask is this. If Lemuria still moves within us, across song, skin, syntax, what other continents are we still carrying? There's a kind of clock that doesn't tick, casts a shadow. On a wind-scarred plateau near the village of Madumalai in southern India stands a ring of rough granite pillars, largely forgotten, catalogued as a megalithic site in a fading government registry. There are no signs, no tourist brochures. Most locals don't even know it's there. But once a year, in mid-January at sunrise, something happens. A single shaft of light passes perfectly between two uprights and lands on a flat stone in the center. It lasts only a minute, and then it's gone. Archaeologists date the site to around 1000 BCE, perhaps older. But no one has studied its solar alignments. It isn't Stonehenge. It isn't sexy. It's just a few rocks on a hill. And yet, year after year, the light still comes. The stones still speak. But we no longer speak back. Across peninsular India, dozens of these megalithic sites, dolmens, menhirs, stone circles, stand in quiet grids, often dismissed as burial sites. But recent LiDAR scans reveal something stranger. They aren't random. Their orientations often align to solstices, equinoxes, and lunar standstills. Some face starrise points that haven't matched the horizon in over 10,000 years. Who built these clocks? And why have we stopped reading them? In the Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Indian astronomical treatise compiled around the 4th century CE, but citing sources from far earlier, the solar year is calculated with remarkable precision. 365.2523627 days. Modern science clocks it at 365.256363804. The difference is negligible, a rounding error. But what's most haunting isn't the number. It's the footnote. The text claims the knowledge is remembered, not discovered. Passed down through prior yugas. Not invented. Recalled. That word again, remember. How do you remember a number that accurate without modern instruments? Unless your instruments weren't tools but architecture. Stone. Shadow. Chant. Motion. Perhaps Lemuria's great structures were not monuments, but mechanisms. Living devices built into the body of the earth itself. Calendars you could walk through. Time you could stand inside. This shifts the frame again. Lemuria as not merely a sunken land, but a timekeeping civilization. A global chronometer system distributed across geographies. Each node tuned to a cycle, a star, a resonance. A harmonic web that collapsed not from war, but from water. Water doesn't burn. It buries. But buried doesn't mean broken. In Indonesia, the Borobudur temple rises like a terraced mandala, with 72 stupas circling its upper platform. Each one holds a Buddha. Each one faces a precise angle. And when mapped against star paths, their arrangement echoes the processional movement of the earth over tens of thousands of years. These are not artistic flourishes. They are mnemonic devices. In Angkor Wat, Cambodia, solar and lunar alignments are embedded into causeways and courtyards. In Chichen Itza, Mexico, serpents of shadow slither down stone stairs on equinox days. In Nabta Playa, Egypt, standing stones mark the heliacal rising of Sirius as early as 7000 BCE. And in South India, the temples breathe with the same pulse. The Brihadiswarar temple's inner sanctum is lit for exactly 216 seconds during midday on the summer solstice. 216 being the same number of breaths per hour prescribed in yogic texts. The Ranganathaswamy temple's 7 enclosures mirror the Vedic cosmological layers, each aligned with nested lunar cycles. Not chance. Design. And that design suggests something more, a civilizational knowledge of time that is not linear but recursive, like a spiral, like a tide, like memory returning in waves. So what happens when such a civilization sinks? It doesn't vanish. It refracts. In the Andaman Islands, Tribal navigators still reckon time by the walking moon, a sequence of tidal rhythms, fish migrations, and sky colorations. In Tamil Nadu, farmers plant not by almanac but by scent, claiming the air itself tells them when rain is coming. In Madagascar, the anti-Moro people guard sacred Sorabi manuscripts, scripted in a secret Arabic-Tamil fusion language, encoding lunar cycles, migration stories, and cosmological diagrams. No empire connects these groups, only a pattern, a pulse. And perhaps Lemuria was the culture that once held that pulse intact, a global seed system of knowledge designed to outlast itself, embedded not in capital cities but in peripheries, not in temples but in thresholds, not in names but in numbers, numbers like 108, the sacred number found in Hindu rosaries, Buddhist malabids, and Vedic cosmology, 108 sun widths between the earth and sun, 108 moon diameters from earth to moon, 108 steps in the temples of Angkor, the sacred path in Mecca, the names of the Buddha, a pattern encoded across continents, faiths, and calendars. Why? Because 108 is not a belief, it's a frequency. And what if Lemuria understood that? What if its knowledge wasn't esoteric but harmonic, a system of living math encoded in movement, ritual, and stone? Then its disappearance isn't failure, it's succession. Memory passed down not as doctrine but as drumbeat, as syllable, as sunrise hitting the right stone at the right second. Which leaves us with this: if the clocks are still ticking, why are we no longer looking? Maps are made to tell us where we are, but sometimes they tell us where we used to be. In 1513, the Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis compiled a world map that should not have existed. Drawn from older source materials, some, he claimed, dating back to the time of Alexander, it depicted parts of the Americas with alarming accuracy. But that's not the part that confounds. Along the lower edge of the map, a faint contour arcs around the South Pole, drawn not as ice but as land. Mountains, valleys, rivers, features no explorer in 1513 could have known. Mainstream historians dismiss it as coincidence, cartographic error, artistic license. But in 1960, the U.S. Air Force Cartographic Division compared the map's Antarctic features to seismic data taken under the ice. The match was real. Not exact, but eerily close. Someone had mapped the Antarctic coast before it was buried. And if that's true, then time itself bends. Because Antarctica's ice cap is believed to be over 6,000 years old, possibly older. For that land to be seen, for it to be mapped, the civilization doing it would have to predate Sumer, predate the wheel, predate history, which is exactly what Lemuria suggests. Not that there was one lost continent, but that our concept of first is flawed, because every culture with memory speaks of an earlier one. The Egyptians whispered of Zeptepi, the first time when the gods walked as men and brought order. The Mesopotamians told of Eridu, the first city created by divine architects. The Vedas speak of Satya Yuga, a golden age of harmony before decline. The Tamil Sangam legends claim 3 literary academies, 2 of which were lost to the sea. And the Mayans recorded the end of not one, but 3 previous worlds. Each of these myths shares something strange. The idea that knowledge came fully formed, not gradually, not through trial and error, but handed down or recovered. What if they're all telling the same story? And what if the memory of Lemuria isn't a memory at all, but a map hidden in metaphor? In the temple carvings of South India, particularly in Chidambaram and Madurai, there are sequences that baffle iconographers. Panels depicting boats in flames, trees upside down, lines of figures walking backward into water. Often dismissed as symbolic, these motifs may be more literal than we think. Mythic compression, visual metaphors for cataclysm, for loss. The flaming boats may echo migrations made in desperation, exoduses as coastlines disappeared beneath rising tides. The inverted trees, symbols of worlds turned upside down. The figures walking backward, remnants of a ritual that encoded astronomical retrograde motion. In ancient astronomy, retrograde is the optical illusion where planets appear to move backward in the sky. Most saw it as chaos, but Vedic astronomers understood it as rhythm. Motion nested inside motion. They recorded it, named it, harmonized with it. What if these carvings were not only art, but record? Memory pressed into stone, not just of people or kings, but of changes, of the earth's tilt, of the sky's turning. This is how Lemuria survives, not as land, but as symbol, but symbols erode. In 2004, after the Indian Ocean tsunami, children in the Andaman Islands pointed inland and ran. Their parents followed. The sea rose, but they were safe. When asked how they knew, they said they remembered the old story, the one about the time when the sea came to eat the sun. It wasn't metaphor. It was code, ancestral instruction embedded in myth, passed down through language that seemed like legend until it wasn't. So what else have we misread? Consider the Yali, a mythical creature carved into temple pillars across South India, part lion, part elephant, part serpent. It's long been interpreted as a symbol of power, but some scholars believe it's more than that it represents fusion, convergence, a composite of creatures from different regions, a symbolic map of cultural migration. And if you overlay known sea routes from the time of the early Dravidian navigators onto the geographic dispersal of Yali iconography, a pattern emerges, a spiral from South India arcing toward Madagascar, curling through the Seychelles and ending along the East African coast. Art as vector, ornament as archive. We've always left memory in strange places. In 2015, divers off the coast of Gujarat discovered a set of stone anchors lying on the seabed in precise alignment. Not scattered as if from shipwrecks, laid out, fixed. Their shapes matched anchors found in Oman and Kenya, thousands of miles away. But no ship could have carried them so far in antiquity. Unless it wasn't a ship. It was a route, a path, marked not on the water but under it. So perhaps Lemuria wasn't destroyed. It was drowned, yes, but more than that. It was fragmented, dispersed, shattered into rituals, melodies, oral stories, temple layouts, drum patterns, and genetic codes. A civilization that anticipated catastrophe and sent itself forward, not in vaults, but in bodies, not in books, but in breath, in rhythm, in metaphor. But metaphor needs memory to remain alive. Without someone to interpret, the code dies. A spiral becomes just a pattern. A drumbeat becomes just music. A chant becomes just words. Unless someone remembers how to feel the shape of it. Because that's the final heresy of Lemuria. That it isn't a puzzle to solve. It's a language to relearn. And maybe we were never meant to find Lemuria. We were meant to become it again. There are places where land turns into story. And there are stories that turn back into land. In the far southern tip of India, where the sea lashes against the rocks near Kanyakumari, lies a small, unremarkable outcropping known locally as Vivekananda Rock. Tourists come for the view, for the sunrise, for the pilgrimage. But few realize that the rock itself has another name, far older, whispered in broken Tamil and lost Pali. Kumaramunai, the daughter's corner. It's not a metaphor in pre-colonial texts and oral chants. This location is marked as the tip of Kumarakandam, the mythical sunken land spoken of in Tamil epics, whose last visible piece was said to be this very rock, before the ocean swallowed the rest. But the myth is not linear. In one version, the land was lost as punishment. In another, a sacrifice. And in yet another, it wasn't lost at all. It simply changed form. It became invisible. Not gone. Just translated. And here the spiral tightens. What if Lemuria Kumarakandam was not destroyed but transformed? What if its knowledge, its structures, its very terrain was encoded into a different medium? Not stone, but sound. Not buildings, but grammar. In Tamil, one of the oldest living languages on earth, grammar is more than structure. It is cosmology. The Tolkappiyam, a foundational grammatical treatise dated as early as 300 BCE, though citing far older material, doesn't just teach how to write. It teaches how to perceive. Time is divided not by clocks, but by emotional states. Space is mapped not by coordinates, but by mood. The landscape is expressed in Tanai, ecological, psychological, and poetic zones simultaneously. Mountains for love, forests for separation, shores for waiting, deserts for war, agriculture for reunion, grammar as memory, poetry as geography, syntax as map. Scholars have long admired this for its sophistication, but few have asked the deeper question. What kind of civilization invents a language in which emotion, ecology, and space are interchangeable? Unless that civilization came from a world where land and life were not separate, where everything was resonance, where loss was expected and prepared for, not with walls but with verses, not with monuments but with metrics. Because when you know your land will disappear, you do not try to preserve it in stone. You plant it in breath. And so the grammar survives. The rhythm of Venpa, a poetic meter so tightly structured it resembles music theory. The Pa, a meter whose length matches lunar cycles. The internal rhymes that mirror tidal movement. These were not literary accidents. They were tidal gauges, memory rituals, recitations designed to preserve more than stories, to preserve rhythm itself, because rhythm is hard to drown. In 2018, a comparative linguistics study traced phonetic migration patterns between Austroasiatic, Dravidian, and Malayo-Polynesian language groups. The researchers noted a repeating motif. Open vowel, nasally end phrases used to encode positional references. In Tamil, Kajaku, east. In Tagalog, Silangan, east. In Malagasy, Atnanana, east. These aren't derived from one another, but they rhyme. They pulse with similar breath. The linguists called it coincidence, but maybe it's something deeper. A shared oral memory, a rhythm carried across water, a direction embedded in sound, and sound, unlike stone, floats, which is perhaps why Lemuria survives better in music than in ruins. In the scales of Carnatic ragas, the microtones of Javanese gamelan, the chants of the Anti-Moro scribes, the call and response traditions of East African coastal tribes, there are echoes, not just in melody, but in modal shifts, in time signatures, in breath counts, even in silence. The space between notes in a raga alapana, a free-form musical invocation, is sacred. It's not empty. It's intentional, structured silence. The same kind of silence encoded in temple architecture. Corridors that constrict sound. Sanctums that contain echo. Inner chambers that absorb even the loudest breath. These silences are not voids. They are the sea, the space that comes after the land, the medium of Lemuria. So perhaps what we're searching for beneath the waves is not submerged temples or drowned libraries. Perhaps those were never the point. Perhaps the real Lemuria, its intelligence, its method, has been hiding in plain sight. In language, in ritual, in silence. And maybe this is why every culture touched by the Indian Ocean has a flood myth that ends not in fire, but in sound. The thunder that comes after the rising, the chant that guides the survivors, the song that rebuilds memory. Because once you lose the land, you cannot walk your history. You must sing it, and singing is spatial. It carries memory not forward, but outward, across generations, across water, until one day someone stands at the edge of a rock at Kanyakumari and hears not the waves, but the pulse behind them, the rhythm behind the noise, a language too old for words, a song written in syntax, and a name we've long forgotten how to pronounce. Maybe Lemuria was never the name of a place. Maybe it was the title of a poem we're still reciting. Not everything is forgotten by accident. Some things are buried on purpose. In 1965, a quiet paper was published in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bombay, written by Dr. Indira Krishnamurti, a relatively unknown archaeolinguist. The article focused on lexical anomalies in pre-Sangam Tamil inscriptions, words and syntax that didn't match later Tamil, nor any known Dravidian branch. She argued that these inscriptions preserved fragments of a proto-language, a UR form that predated not only Tamil but structured language itself. Her thesis was clear. What we were looking at wasn't an early dialect. It was the memory of a lost grammar, one embedded in timekeeping, ritual motion, and directionality, not designed for storytelling but for calibration. She called it temporal syntax, a way of speaking that reflected how people experienced time in spiral patterns, not lines. Her sources were obscure, half-translated palm leaf manuscripts, oral chant lines recorded in the 1930s, and temple floor diagrams forgotten by scholarship. The academic response was silence, no citations, no rebuttals, just absence. Her name never appeared again in any major publication, and yet her theory never fully vanished. It lingered like an unspoken footnote in the work of those who studied beyond the sanctioned edges, whispered in the back rows of Indology conferences, printed in obscure proceedings, relegated to footnotes, but persistent, because the anomalies wouldn't go away. In 2003, satellite imaging near the Gulf of Mannar revealed unexpected bathymetric features, linear ridges, radial terraces, and what appeared to be cross patterns of submerged stone. The data was preliminary, but the formations resembled layouts, plazas, or corridors far below current sea level. Within days, local and international teams began arguing natural geology or artificial remnants. Then the data stopped coming. Access was restricted. Funding retracted. The public imaging resolution reduced. When asked, officials responded with technical vagueness. The data are under review. It's not conspiracy. It's discomfort. Because if even one of these formations is real, if even one submerged stair or plaza or stone avenue is human-made, it reframes everything. Not just the timeline of Indian civilization, but the entire structure of history itself. Lemuria stops being a fantasy. It becomes a problem, because the deeper you dig, the more patterns surface. Not just in terrain or tradition, but in silence itself. Why do mainstream historical narratives consistently begin in deserts, not coasts? Why do the earliest cities we study rise from river valleys, not island chains? Why are flood myths universally regarded as metaphor, despite geological evidence of global sea rise, despite drowned shorelines, despite submerged artifacts? And why is it that the only sunken cities we're allowed to name are Greek? It's not an accident. Empires write history upward, but Lemuria descends. It doesn't build towers. It builds memory spirals, structures not meant to dominate, but to synchronize. And synchronization is subversive, because once you begin to notice it, you see it everywhere, in the identical ratios between Angkor's causeways and those of Meenakshi Temple, in the astronomical correspondence between Nabta stones and the Prambanan complex in Java, in the linguistically mirrored chants between the Bil people of Western India and the Sakalava elders of Madagascar. Unrelated or refracted memory, because here's what we now know. Between 14,000 and 7,000 years ago, Earth's sea levels rose by over 120 meters. During this time, entire coastlines disappeared, island chains were reduced to reefs, and whatever lived there, whatever was built, mapped, sung, was swallowed but not erased. Because erasure is only complete when memory ceases to replicate. And Lemuria continues to replicate. In myth, in ritual, in syllable, in the persistent architectural logic of temples built long after their creators forgot why they faced east at that exact angle, or why the sanctum must hum at a certain pitch, they remember what we no longer understand. And sometimes, understanding arrives late. In 2017, a team of archaeoseismologists published a study showing that ancient Indian temples were often constructed along fault lines, not by coincidence, but by design. Builders knew where the earth flexed. They tuned their stone accordingly. These weren't just places of worship. They were sensors. And before they were temples, they may have been echoes, resonant receivers tuned to ground vibration, celestial passage, and atmospheric change. Instruments of memory, not metaphors but mechanisms. And what if Lemuria was never lost, but returned to the waveform it came from? A civilization too entangled with the cycles of Earth to resist the pull of water, too attuned to permanence to fear submersion. A people who understood that memory was safest not in stone, but in sequence. So they scattered, left behind coordinates made of stars, sound, and salt, and trusted the next turning of the spiral. Now, as sea levels rise again, and the earth heats with the memory of its own breath, the spiral turns once more. The question is no longer whether Lemuria existed. It's whether we've yet earned the right to remember it. There is a kind of silence that arrives only at the end of a journey, not the silence of absence, but the silence of return, of circling back to a place you didn't know you'd left behind, the kind that doesn't ask for answers, only acknowledgement. By now, the question of Lemuria has changed. It is no longer about whether a continent sank beneath the Indian Ocean, not about temples under the tide, or forgotten stone alignments, or anomalous DNA patterns stretching from Tamil Nadu to Madagascar, not even about what maps did or didn't survive the burnings of Alexandria, or who remembered the stars before they had names. Lemuria is the name we've given to a pattern we feel but cannot hold. It's the presence of structure inside a myth, the tension in a chant whose syllables taste older than the tongue that utters them, the curve of a temple corridor that leads nowhere, and yet arrives. It is a memory system that refuses to die, and perhaps that's why it haunts us. Because it didn't vanish in conquest. It wasn't buried in rubble. It slipped quietly, beneath a sea that rose too slowly to fear and too quickly to fight. It disappeared not in fire or war, but in rhythm, in the turning of the earth's axis, in breath. Maybe Lemuria didn't fall. Maybe it exhaled, and with that breath, scattered itself. Into languages, into architecture, into ritual, into song, into the bodies of those who would migrate, carry, remember. Not to preserve history, but to preserve structure. To encode not events, but relationships between land and sky, sound and stone, story and cycle. This is what we keep circling in every tradition the modern world has called primitive. The idea that knowing is not acquisition, but alignment. To know is to be in the right place at the right time, saying the right word at the right pitch. A ritual, a frequency, a tuning of the self to something wider. It's why the precession of the equinoxes mattered. Why megaliths were built in the direction of Sirius. Why chants were timed to the rise of the Pleiades. Why children drew spirals in rice flour at dawn. These weren't acts of superstition. They were calendars, algorithms, hymns of coherence. But coherence is fragile. It breaks when severed from land, from language, from rhythm, from sky. And yet, it also returns in fragments, in moments, in the uncanny feeling that you've been somewhere before, in a melody that loops too perfectly with your breath. In the pause inside a mantra that makes your spine respond before your mind can understand why. In the unshakable idea that this life is not the first time you've walked these steps. That's what Lemuria leaves behind. Not facts, not ruins, not a headline, a sensation. A pressure in the chest when standing before an ocean horizon and feeling, not small, but remembered, not watched but felt, like the sea knows your name even if you don't. That's the spiral. The return not to a physical homeland, but to a relational truth. That we belong not to nations but to patterns. That history is not a straight line behind us, but a living helix we're still inside. And perhaps that's what the old navigators meant when they sang their maps into the waves. They weren't describing a route. They were remembering a relationship. And now, as we stand at the edge of another rising sea, ice melting, climates shifting, tides reclaiming, we are being asked to listen again, to chant the coordinates back into being, to trace with our lives the echo of something ancient that still hums beneath the silt and stone. Because maybe the earth hasn't forgotten. Maybe it's been humming the same song all along. And now, like a tuning fork struck long ago, we are vibrating to meet it once more. What is Lemuria? It is the question that never stops asking.